Hey, everybody, and welcome to Thursdays at the Museum. I'm Amanda Harrison, a community engagement manager for the Detroit Institute of Art. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program, a discussion about women artists and musicians from the 15 to 1800s with Dr. Eve Straussman-Pflanzer, curator and head of Italian and Spanish paintings at the National Gallery of Art, previously serving as head of the European Art Department and the Elizabeth and Alan Sheldon Curator of European Paintings at the Detroit Institute of Arts, and Dr. Elizabeth Weinfield, an assistant professor of music history at the Juilliard School in New York. Prior to the DIA, Dr. Eve Straussman-Pflanzer served as an assistant director of curatorial affairs / senior curator of collections at the Davis Museum of Wesley College. Prior to that, she held positions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Art Institute of Chicago. At the AIC, she also curated the 2013 exhibition Violence and Virtue, Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith, Slain Holofernes, in many ways a precursor to the DIA's upcoming show. She is an authority on Italian paintings in the early modern period and an expert on early modern women artists and patrons. Dr. Straussman-Pflanzer is a native of New York City. She holds a BA from the Smith College of Northampton, Massachusetts, and a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University. Dr. Elizabeth Weinfield is an assistant professor of music history at the Juilliard School in New York, whose research explores the relationship among gender, performance, and race in the early modern period. Her interests include music by women in the crypto-Jewish communities of Antwerp, music in the 17th century Constantinople era, performance practice, and historiography. She holds a PhD in historical musicology from the Graduate Center CUNY and is an artistic director of the Ensemble Sonnambula, with whom she has performed at cultural institutions all over the country, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and many more. Her recording with Sonnambula of the music of the 17th century composer Leonora Duarte won the American Musicological Society's Jewish Studies Award. This program touches on the larger themes explored in our upcoming exhibition By Her Hand, opening February 6th, and serves as an introduction for a virtual concert with the Chamber Ensemble Sonnambula, March 31st. Welcome, everyone. So glad to have Eve and Elizabeth here.
Hi, ladies. Thanks for being here.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have both of you joining us today because By Her Hand, Artemisia Gentileschi and Women Artists in Italy, 1500 to 1800, explores the untold role of women artists in Italy from the birth of the Renaissance until the Enlightenment. And Sonnambula is dedicated to bringing to light unknown compositions for period instruments with a lush sound of the viol at the core. Recent projects include the first complete recording of works by Leonora Duarte, who we'll hear more about today. And little attention has been paid to these women artists in the Renaissance and Baroque era, with scholars and museums really choosing largely to focus on their male counterparts. I'd like to ask both of you, what brought you to the subject? Let's start with Eve.
Sure. Thanks so much, Amanda, for these opening remarks. It's been quite a journey, and I'm thinking back to when I first learned about women artists. In college, I went to an all-women's college, Smith College, and there was mention in the survey of Artemisia Gentileschi, and I took note. But there were very few other women artists mentioned. And as, someone that's interested in gender issues and feminism, when I got to graduate school, the first seminar that I had opportunity to take was actually in preparation for a show at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that featured Artemisia Gentileschi and her father Orazio. So I was on the ground in this seminar as the curator was preparing for this show. And it opened up a world. I was interested in Artemisia's life, how she became successful, what she created and why. But then I was really left with the question, can she really be the only one? And it was through that sort of seminar that I was finding little pieces here and there, of shows that had happened, starting in the 1970s, due to the feminist movement. But I can talk about that more later. I think I'll turn it to Elizabeth to let us hear a bit about how she became interested in early modern women musicians and composers.
Well, thank you so much, Eve, my old colleague. It's such a delight to be reunited with you in this forum, and thank you, Amanda, also for having us both today. I think the sense of discovery that Eve just mentioned really resonates with me a lot. I mean, first of all, I should say that I discovered a lot of this music myself through sight reading with friends in a sort of casual way. And this is how I stumbled upon the work of Leonora Duarte, who has already been published, but at that time hadn't been recorded or treated to any kind of critical study in any sense. I was struck by, frankly, just how fine the music was. And so it was curious to me that there's just not more of a sort of scholarly record about her. But the sense of discovery was really quite potent. This kind of excitement of knowing that I was likely one of the few people in the world that was hearing Duarte's voice, really, since it had been put down to paper, some 400 years ago. So from there, from this first hearing, from this first exposure, I started to investigate her story, and her story was compelling. She's a Jewish converso, so a woman of Jewish ancestry who was forced to convert to Catholicism, as so many Jews were after the Inquisition. She was born in Antwerp to a quite prominent family of merchants and art collectors who were friends of the keyboard making dynasty, the Rupers Cruchet, whose instruments wind up in a lot of paintings of this time, and quickly found out that her compositional output is so small. We have 7 very short pieces that remain by her, and we'll hear one a little bit later on. They're called Sinfonias, and they're, as Amanda mentioned earlier, they're some of the only music that we have from the 17th century for the viola da gamba written by a woman. And if anyone is wondering what a viola da gamba is, I actually have mine right here. So what you're seeing in front of me is a tenor viola da gamba. They come in 3 sizes. The treble is the smallest, tenor is the middle size, this one, and the bass viola da gamba, or the bass viol, is the largest. And you can see that it actually looks quite different from the instruments that we know to be in the modern orchestra, violins, violas, cellos, and so on. This is a 6-string instrument, and it's fretted like a guitar. And in fact, it is actually related to a guitar. At some point, someone decided to put a bow to a guitar and see what happened. And throughout the 16th and 17th century, it sort of develops a repertoire, and much of the music is written by women, and that's quite extraordinary.
It really is. And I'm eager to jump into learning more about these women composers and artists. Eve's already mentioned the word feminism a couple of times, and I'd like to start with Elizabeth on this one to elaborate. How has feminism influenced interest in these works? And then
Hmm.
what do you see the role of museums or universities playing in contributing and promoting these influential artists and their craft?
It's such a great question, and I should mention that at Juilliard right now I'm actually teaching a graduate seminar on women composers before 1800, and it's a full class full of enthusiastic students who want to learn. Now, what happens when we turn our focus to women in history? What we're seeing is the emergence of voices. But these voices are always around us. They're resonating around us all the time. But some have been locked behind unjust historical ignorance. Some are forgotten amidst the sort of shifting priorities of certainly not a feminist scholarship, but sort of lost behind these sort of priorities of professional scholarship. And then others are there, but they've been rendered silent by gendered language. So when I work, I ask questions such as how do these women resist the constraints of their era? How do various kinds of music work against dominant social structures? And also, how does music making, and especially by the female voice, open up a very fertile space, as it were, for resistance? And toward this end, we can see that we can explicitly set ourselves the task of showing the ways in which the people that we study, the women that we study, can challenge stereotypes. Now, there's a long history of famous women who were powerful in their own time, their own place. And so often this history before 1800 is thought to be set by nation states or by borders. We think a lot about this in early music, particularly in Baroque music, about the concept of national style. But so many of the lives of women musicians in the early modern period, either due to patronage, due to religious status, or other aspects of their lives, work against these strict dictates of nationhood and otherwise. And so their success, the fact that we are here together talking about them in 2022, really subverts this. Duarte, for example, is someone who was unrecognized as a full citizen due to her religion because it was illegal to be Jewish in 17th century Antwerp. And so her success subverts the idea of nationhood as a prerequisite for legitimacy. So these kinds of stories are really important. They're foundational, in fact. They're also half the narrative.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, Elizabeth, to hear you speak about, these sort of lost voices and using the register of sound, because when you shift over to paintings, there's, I also think of lost voices, but I also think of lost stories. And then, of course, turning to the image, representation, right? Who is representing certain subjects? And then some of the questions that I ask, and then I want to turn to the feminism portion of your question, Amanda, is in a subject that we'll get to soon, such as Artemisia's Judith slaying Holofernes. How does Artemisia Gentileschi, as a woman in the 17th century, depict this subject, and how does it compare to representations or visualizations of this subject by her male peers? And it doesn't always, but in many instances, it does in interesting ways that give these women artists that we may not have a lot of, say, letters by their hands or sort of record of their voice, a way to hear their voice through the image. And I think that that's a powerful way to talk about it. I think, turning to the first part of the question about feminism, it's been very interesting in doing the show for the Detroit Institute of Arts to sort of trace the trajectory of exhibitions of women artists in museums, both, internationally, but particularly in the United States. And you do see that right at the beginning of the 1970s, so the birth of second wave feminism in the United States and also Western Europe, that you see small shows popping up. They seem to be very ad hoc. They may not have, a real catalog. It may be a checklist. It may be a Xerox. And then by the time you get to 76, 77, you have that landmark exhibition, Women Artists, 1550 to 1950, that looked at representations in European and American art making in that period. And what's fascinating is that you see a wealth of exhibitions with the birth of second wave feminism in the 70s. And then you do see them periodically. I tried to trace them. Again, starting again in the early 2000s. And then in the last 10 years, that's when we see the greatest flourishing of these shows. And it seems to me that there is something to connect to the Me Too movement, who gets to speak, whose voices. And I think it's also important when we think about our institutions to think about who's making the decisions, right? Of who gets included in collections. In museums such as the Detroit Institute of Arts, the collections are growing. We make acquisitions. What are we acquiring? Can we find works by women artists? And in fact, in my tenure here, I was able to find some and bring some to the collection. And that, even just placing an object on the wall, changes the narrative, because you can no longer deny the presence because it is now in your face. So, as Elizabeth was saying, power structures, feminism, they all sort of intersect. But we're seeing another wave of great concentrated interest in women artists of all types across the board right now. It's a wonderful moment, in my opinion.
And Eve, did I read, is this one of the first shows, I guess, of this size and of its kind to come to the Detroit Institute of Arts, one of the oldest museums in North
that is
America?
true. So, this show started at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, which is really regarded by many as the first civic, museum that started in the 19th century. The Detroit Institute of Art comes along pretty soon thereafter. And yes, this is the first exhibition to focus on earlier women artists that have ever taken place at these two institutions. Which I'll just leave as a comment and let everyone to absorb that, because I think that in itself, saying it's the first, is quite a statement unto itself.
Absolutely. I feel like it's an exciting time in our history to be seeing this happen, and to have the two of you, here being a part of it. It's an honor to have you here. So I'd like to ask you, you've already mentioned some of the women that we'll be focusing on today. If you wouldn't mind telling me a little bit more about these women, just briefly, and then what the challenges that you faced when, organizing an exhibition like this or discovering more information about the women. What were some of your hurdles that you had to overcome? And let's start with Eve.
So, these are great questions, and I will try to keep my answer to a reasonable length. So, Artemisia Gentileschi, what's fascinating is I'd mentioned this seminar I took in a show that happened at the Met in the early 2000s. Of the women artists in the show, Artemisia Gentileschi is one of 17 different women artists. So she is an entry point, because I think, of women artists, she has become one of the most famous. There's been films, there's been books on her. She almost has sort of a celebrity status that sort of represents early feminism in this way for people. You see a lot of activity on social media. And so really looking at Artemisia as an entry point or a gateway into, then, if people had even heard of her name, which not everyone has, and it's not necessary, would allow people to come in to then get exposed to a range of other artists. And, there are only, I say only, actually 17 is a sizable number, but there were hundreds. And I think, to your point, Amanda, about challenges, is that a lot of them we know in name only. So in period primary sources, they're mentioned, but we don't have any surviving works that we can connect to them. So, one of the challenges is, how do we represent women artists when we don't know of surviving works? And I think what is very fascinating is that when we look to the 1970s and the works that were in that landmark show I mentioned, we know so much more because there's been, a next generation of scholars that have done research that then we can assign names to works. And, there's a hot market. So dealers and auction houses, for lack of a better word, want to capitalize on that. And so there's just a growing interest, and therefore we know about more women artists and we know of more works. And so there's been this journey getting to this point, which is really exciting, that there are works of art that were being discovered up until the last year of the exhibition. I'm thinking of a work that you'll see in the show, Veronica Stern-Telly, Artemisia. I mentioned Artemisia Gentileschi, but I have to say one of my favorite artists, and I almost did my dissertation on her, Elizabeth Weinfield, who you see here, this exquisite painting of Portia wounding her thigh. It's a real opportunity to introduce the public to these lesser known women artists with these forceful images, such as Portia wounding her thigh. I mean, just in brief, this subject, what you see is that Portia, who is married to Brutus, and he goes on to eventually assassinate Julius Caesar. And she can tell that there's something going on with her husband, Brutus. He's holding a secret, but he won't tell her. And so she pierces her own thigh to prove that she can withstand the pain, and therefore she can also safely hold his secret of this assassination plot. So you see a woman artist showing this moment of women's courage. And what's also important is that this is not a subject that is represented by male artists. It's Elizabeth Asrani deciding and really making this subject her own. It's really one of the highlights of the show for me, and just a powerful statement by women artists in 17th century Bologna. And I'll turn the floor to Elizabeth.
There's so much scope here for a music curator, as it were, to decide what pieces of music should complement this exhibition. I've spoken a bit about Duarte, and I'll speak a little bit more about her a little bit later. But for the concert that we are preparing for the DIA via the YouTube channel that you're watching right now on March 31st, we will be performing some repertoire by Francesca Caccini, who Artemisia Gentileschi would have undoubtedly known in Florence. Also Barbara Strozzi, who was in Gentileschi's circle and likely knew her at the Academy. Both Strozzi and Caccini wrote the Lament, and there was a love, some might even say a kind of craze, for sung laments. Some were operatic in nature, some were monodic, or thus sung by a single voice. And many of their laments are related in some way thematically to the kinds of protagonists that we see in some of these works, particularly in Gentileschi's paintings, women who have been wronged in some way. We're also probably going to be featuring a work or two by Isabella Leonarda, who was a nun. And I'm going to use this opportunity with Leonarda to sort of cast a light on music making in convents, which was a vital and very active place for music making in the early modern period, particularly in Italy. So all together with this concert that we're preparing, we're essentially hoping to paint a broad picture of music making by women in the early modern period, the period of by her hand, but with this sort of central goal that I think is very similar to Eve's show, which is that many women were making music at this time, and they did so in different ways. They did so in different environments, and they really excelled at it.
That does pique my curiosity, because maybe it's just my own fault, but I think of women's role as unfortunately being in the home during this time. You're saying that they're making music, they're making art, they're working in nunneries, creating these compositions. What was the scope in which these women worked, and were they recognized for the contributions that they were making? And let's start with Elizabeth.
Some certainly were in their lifetime, and we know this through testimony. But yes, music was happening in nunneries. Women sang in convents. Women used string instruments. They accompanied each other. They sang polyphony, and they also, as Laurie Strauss has recently argued, they used wind instruments, which is kind of shocking because there was at the same time this sort of very courtly disdain for women playing wind instruments because of the associations with fecundity, with sort of earthly pleasures, and so on. There's also a fascinating connection between music making in convents and a special kind of all-female musical ensemble that was known as the Concerto De La Dama. These were sort of secret groups of female musicians. They sang, they probably accompanied each other, and they provided private performances for their patrons, or sometimes for some visiting dignitaries or nobles that would come through their city-state. They were probably noblewomen themselves, or they were ladies in waiting. But what's sort of fascinating about this practice is that everything about their music making was secretive. So what they performed, how they ornamented their work. And we're just now starting to learn more about their practices by examining, for example, how they ornamented some of their repertoire. Sometimes it wasn't written down, but after sort of the heyday of these ensembles, it was written down. It was kind of conscribed to paper to sort of keep a record of it, decades after the practice was extinct, a kind of memorialization, if you like. Many Italian courts that patronized some of the women by her hand had these ensembles on hand, these Concerto De La Dama. But the ensemble that was in Ferrara was really sort of thought to be the best. And there's an interesting resonance here, having just recently perused, Eve, your wonderful catalog, with some of these sort of small, precious objects that Sofonisba Anguissola makes. This idea of private contemplation, private consumption. And it's fascinating that as I read, she sends a lot of them to Ferrara, the sort of center of this musica secreta, this private music-making practice. There's another place where we also see music making by women in the 16th and 17th centuries, and that is in the home, but in particular in the Kunstkammer, or the art room, the art salon of the home. Duarte, for example, was from a prominent merchant family. They were jewel merchants, and they were also art collectors as well. And we know from testimony that Duarte definitely performed her own music in her home. She performed for traveling diplomats, for musicians who were passing through the city, other prominent figures who leave testimony about her abilities. And so we also have this idea of the politics of looking and display that govern these kinds of art spaces. They should also inform our kind of our sort of listening experiences as well. And so it's actually kind of very apropos that we have this collaboration that we have now. So when we start to think about these women alongside their families' art collections as objects of display themselves, we start to think about them as taking real pride of place in their family, similar to the place that high culture, that musical performance also held in the family. And so this music largely grows out of this space. It's a kind of material artifact, ironically, a sort of testament to the family's investment in empirical observation, the sort of proof of specific connections between observation and social status that are really encouraged by these semi-public spaces. And actually, now might be a good time. I brought with us an example of Leonora's music, one of her Sinfonias.
We'd love to hear that.
Which we do know was performed in her home amongst her art collection.
Let's give that a listen. Wow, just beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth.
Thanks so much. And I understand we're going to actually have our CD in the DIA gift store, so everybody could purchase a copy if they want.
Absolutely. We're preparing to have that ready for to coincide with the opening of the exhibition. So I'd like to pose the same question to Eve, just to recap, like what we're looking at the scope in which these women artists worked, and I'm wondering if they were recognized for their contributions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still haunted by the music. It's just so beautiful. And I am really fascinated. I've been ruminating since you were speaking on this issue of sort of private music making, who the publics are, and how that's similar and different than women artists. So, what's interesting is, you're saying that there were these secret concerts. Now, what's interesting is, when you start with women artists like Sofonisba Anguissola, who you were mentioning was sending, self-portraits. And I think if you go to the next slide there, is the little miniature of her.
Oh, yes.
Is the type of work exactly that she would have sent to courts like Ferrara, to other patrons that she was hoping to encourage and show her skill, but it was in a way more licit because it's not her performing physically in front of a public, but sending a piece of herself to then be enjoyed, in private because of the small scale, and how that dynamic is different, and somehow more decorous than actually playing music in front of other people. Now, what's interesting is that Sophonisba starts like this, and I should mention, I know we just had a second ago had an image of what is purported to be one of her sisters, and we do know one of her sisters, Elena, entered, a convent. What's interesting is you think of what was possible for these women. So Sophonisba is the most famous, but a number of her sisters were also trained. One marries, one goes to a convent. She's the only one that really continues throughout her whole life, to make art. And what's interesting is that unlike a lot of the other women artists in this show, she was from a very minor nobility. So she is actually invited, to the Spanish court to work for that family and do portraits. So you think of that in terms of private and public. She's entering this other private sphere where she's sanctioned to go because of her minor nobility, but also her skill that allows her, like, her status wouldn't have been enough to bring her to the Spanish court, but
Right.
her social standing combined with her skill affords her the opportunity of entering into the space of the Spanish court. I think what's interesting is that there is really a difference, back to your idea of women who perform musically in a convent with women artists who were nuns. It differs by convent, and their role in society is different because often they would be making art. So ranging from, small crafts to embroidery to paintings and frescoes, often to support their convent financially. And so, it is for sort of economic, monetary reasons. Sometimes it's for fame if it's a wealthier convent. So there's a range of reasons there. And then, the other instances of women artists in the show, a lot of them, unsurprisingly, come from families of artists. So they're trained by their fathers, or their brothers. And Lavinia Fontana, who's in the show, is fascinating because she actually marries another artist, but the reason why that family is very interested in having her wed and join the family is that she's such a skilled artist that she'll be able to financially support the family, right? And these women worked largely often in the home, in a studio setting. But as we increase in time into the 17th century, so not the 16th century, an artist like Elisabetta Sirani, who I showed with Portia, it would actually be almost like a virtuosic performance where, local, the Medici family, if they're passing through Bologna, would stop in her studio, to see her paint. So it wasn't enough just to sort of receive the painting that was sent, say from one city to the other, but actually to see her physically in the process, and then that was lawful. So this idea of, privacy and exposure, sort of shifts. But it always has a different tenure with women artists because for the most part, they are working privately, right? They're not sort of performing their skill and their craft for a public, except in these instances that I mentioned, such as with Elisabetta Sirani. So, I think, just to speak to the last register Elizabeth also spoke about, which is this idea of, performing in the home, this art center. You do, as you get into the 18th century, also get more women artists that are not supporting their family, that are not sort of seeking fame outside of the family unit, but are doing it as part of their education. They are cultivated, they can play music, they can draw or paint a little bit. So you have these different registers, both in the home, the professional artist supporting a family, herself, other family members, and then also those women artists later on who are doing it to show that they have many gifts that make them a well-rounded individual in society. So, it's complex, and we could tease that out even more. But I love this idea of thinking about the public and private registers. I think it's really fruitful.
Yes, I just wonder if there's something about Ferrara that sort of brings about this relationship between the private, secretive nature of art making.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's not only, I mean, just when you're speaking Sfari, but it's also these court environments where I see a lot of growth and possibility, for public and private, but also for women artists, not just musicians, not just painters, but also other types of performance. Because I think of it too, not only were there musical performances, but there was also secret convent productions of theatrical that the nuns would write and perform that the noble women. So I see that as part of sort of a court culture that you see in Ferrara, but you also see, in the Medici Florentine court environment too. And so I think that that is a connective thread there a bit too, but obviously could be teased out further.
Very interesting.
It sounds like there's so many similarities between the two types of art making. And I'm curious if, did Eve, you mentioned that they wanted to show themselves as being well-rounded. Did any of these artists cross disciplinary boundaries? And are there any other similarities that you've seen between the two, that you'd like to mention that we haven't touched on already? And
Sure. I mean, I think if we could bring up, I think we have a slide of Artemisia's self-portrait as a lute player. And you're asking about, crossing distance. So, this is a representation of the painter Artemisia Gentileschi, who's showing herself in the act of playing a lute, but we don't actually know if she could. So what's interesting about this, in terms of a brief overview of her biography, she's born in Rome. She's trained by her father, Orazio. There's a bit of a scandal and a sexual assault that she experiences, which is a large part of her biography and her story. And as a result of that, she marries a Florentine man and moves to Florence and has to navigate a very different environment. And we think of today, Italy as one country, but really it was not united. And so, how you would succeed as an artist in Rome, which is the papal seat, is very different than when you get to Florence, as she did when she marries, and she's now in Medici court circles, where, to succeed, you needed to be very learned, you needed to learn to read and write, because we have documents that when she was in Rome, she actually was illiterate, but by the time she gets to Florence, she does learn to read and write, and we see evidence of her signature on letters. I've seen them myself. I've touch the sheet of paper.
Impressive.
It's very thrilling. And so, I want to ask you, Elizabeth, in a second, a question, about the hand positions here. Like, could you even play a lute like this? But we'll get to that in a second. What I think is fascinating about this image, that's done while she's in Florence, is that you see Artemisia gazing directly, at the viewer, and something you see, and if you saw that miniature earlier that Sofonisba did, she's completely covered up. Here you can see it's a very low cut dress. There's décolletage. So she is using her youthful attractiveness as, part of the story. She's showing her skill as a painter. I painted this by my hand, by her hand. And she's also showing that she has some interest or knowledge of music, or at least the musical circles that were happening in Florence. Elizabeth mentioned Francesca Caccini, that happened, that she was a composer in this milieu. So there's an interest in women practicing in different arts. But we don't always know for instance, whether Artemisia actually could play music, or whether she is just sort of donning the attire of a musician to appeal to clients and potential patrons of her art. But I would be interested, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Elizabeth, if you have any sort of, insights on if this instrument, looks accurate, or, the hand positioning, or is she just sort of fumbling her way through this exercise?
Well, calling all lute players here, please chime in. I mean, she's definitely looking at a real instrument as she's painting. You can see the details of the central rosette sound hole in the middle of the table. You can see the details of the frets. You can see all of the tuning pegs on the back of the scroll, and she also does look like she's potentially barring a chord, so putting your finger across an entire fret. Although again, I'm no lute player myself, and her fingernails look a little bit long. I'd have to look at the picture in person to see. We always have to keep our fingernails very short, unfortunately. Her hands are so delicately placed over this instrument, and lute repertoire is awfully sensual and delicate, and so it's a perfect choice of instrument, I think, in this image, where she is also shown in sort of in such a beautiful spotlit kind of Caravaggesque way, and that spotlighting kind of hits her hands in such a lovely way, and you see that you see both of them at once with equal clarity. Forgive my ignorance here, but isn't it true that in painting, that to be able to render the hand really showed that you had a certain level of achievement as an artist? I mean, so the fact that Gentileschi is painting the hands of this woman so beautifully is really kind of a testament to her abilities as a painter, and it's possible that she wants that to be front and center as well.
Yeah, these are fascinating observations. And it's also making me think of how this picture was actually created. So, you know, when you think of the Sinfonias by Anguissola, there's actually a Latin phrase that said she, you know, painted it with the aid of a mirror. And that was typical in this period, that artists would use a mirror to capture their likenesses. But this raises this very important, and you're absolutely correct with the hands, that, you know, a lot of artists starting in the Renaissance are judged for their ability to render the face and the hands. But how, if you're using a mirror, and we don't know in this instance, do you also use your hands if you're posing with a lute? So it raises the question, did she have a model pose? As we know, you know, Caravaggio, you'd mentioned these strong contrasts of light and dark. She's a follower of Caravaggio. They're known from painting Alla Prima, which is directly on the canvas with a model posing. So did she use a mirror for part of it, for her face, but then have a model pose with a lute, maybe even a musician, so that she could capture accurately the hands? Because you can't pose and use your hands to play a lute and also paint at the same time. I mean, that's, you know, so it's fascinating to think of the construction of an image like this, like actually how it came to be in real time.
Right. Also, women often accompanied themselves while playing a lute, and she's very clearly not singing here. And there's no ambiguity about that whatsoever. So there's a question there as well. There's, of course, so much more to say about that painting, but
yeah,
it's a beautiful image.
I find it so interesting, the different ways that you can communicate through a self-portrait, and the speculation around if she was a lute player or not. She is still creating these ideas and putting her image out there, and it's curated, you know, very specifically to convey the message that she wants to share. And that makes me curious, Elizabeth, if it's possible for a musician to create a self-portrait, and how do we find like the self in music?
That's a very complex question, but a very interesting question. And of course, the major difference between a painting and a piece of music is the aspect of permanence. A painting, if it's taken care of by responsible curators like Eve, will, you know, exist for years. But a performance, of course, dies out. It dies out immediately after it's finished. Of course, a musical score, is a material manifestation, we could say, of music making. But the existence of a score is not really sort of the sole proof of evidence of compositional practices or personality, right? Particularly with music by women. And so if we're thinking of a score-based history as a way into personality, that's an awfully limited history in a sense. It doesn't take into account oral transmission. It doesn't take into account improvisatory practices or music by women who could not, for whatever reason, write down their music or even publish their music. And here Duarte is actually an interesting case, we have a very scant record of her works. As I mentioned, there's just about 25 minutes of music that survives in total, and there's not all that much documentation. Eve brought this question up earlier. How do we thus represent these women when we're sort of circling in the archive, so to speak? There's so much that we don't know. But what we do know is that she existed really within a very complex nexus of diverse influences in very complicated circumstances, in a landscape in 17th century Antwerp where the practice of Judaism was banned, in which Judeo-Portuguese immigrants like her family were sort of forced to live in exile as converted Christians. And at a time when we have this deeply ingrained culture of anti-Semitism that positioned conversion, that positioned identity blending as sort of de rigueur. So because of her Jewish heritage, there are lots of questions about identity in Duarte's music that come up, and she's often sort of by default compared with other Jewish pre-modern composers. And yet this begs the question, as a converted Catholic, is Duarte, after all, a Jewish composer? But if we define Jewish composer in the early modern period as someone who's writing for the synagogue, let's say, then the answer is no. She was not writing for the synagogue because she was a woman. She was not writing for the synagogue because her Jewishness was illegal in her home city and throughout her lifetime. So her complicated and in many ways unidentifiable identity, in this case, her religious identity, cultural identity, if you like, this relationship with Judaism doesn't really fit into the same category that music history has carved out for other outwardly facing Jewish composers in the early modern period. So here's where the music ironically can be a kind of self-portrait in a way. Just by nature of its existence, we see an expanded notion of what Jewish composer means in the early modern period. And her music just exists as a legacy of that very complex history.
Absolutely. It adds to the story and expands it because it gives us a different point of view. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Elizabeth. And I'd like to, our time is running out, so I'd like to get back on the screen just one last portrait because I know Eve wanted to mention this one. Eve, did you say, is this your favorite or among your favorite pieces
It's among
in the
my
show?
it is one of my
Okay.
among my favorites. It's hard to choose. They're also wonderful. But I wanted to bring this up because this is a representation of an artist that I first encountered in person. This is Anna Baccarini Piattoli. Who is she? Well, she was a Florentine woman living in the 18th century. And I first encountered her when I went through the Vasari corridor in Florence, which is a repository. The Medici very early on actually started a formal collection of self-portraits under Leopoldo de' Medici. And this is showing her a self-portrait at the age of 56. So I'd love you to reflect back on the miniature I showed of Sofonisba in her youth. That sort of in Artemisia, this idea of youthful attractiveness. And I find this to be such a powerful image because here you see Anna, there she is at the age of 56. She's showing herself in the act of copying in miniature. You see that on the easel before her, what is a famous fresco by the famous Renaissance artist, Andrea del Sarto, the Madonna del Sacco. That's a fresco lunette that's still in situ in Florence today that you can go see. But she's also showing you that she can, again, paint self-portraits. So not only can she do a copy of a religious subject by a famous artist, she can do self-portraits, but she's also behind you showing a blank canvas, which shows the potential for something more. And, you know, she had a challenging life. She was married. She had 2 sons. Towards the end of her life, her husband died and she was quite destitute.
Hmm.
And as was often the case for artists, male and female, she sent this self-portrait at the age of 56 to the Medici as a gift, in the hoping that they would gift her in return either jewelry or money. And so it was a strategy for survival. And she shows herself, dressed in this wonderful outfit with these blue ribbons, but you don't see her flowing hair. You see her age in her face. She's not trying to beautify herself. She's just staring out with the word that really unprepossessing gaze. She's powerful. She's in charge. You don't want to mess with Anna Boccherini Piattoli. And she's showing a woman in the 18th century who's older, but has worth and has skill. And I find that to be so, so powerful and
Absolutely.
fascinating.
I think it's it's a good example of what you're trying to do, I think, in part with this show. It's showing these strong, beautiful, brilliant women from all different walks of life. I think you captured that so well and by her hand. And we are out of time, so I would just like to ask, let's start with Elizabeth. Do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience today?
Nothing else than just it's a pleasure to have this kind of conversation, because it inevitably brings up so many leads that I want to pursue and things I'd like to investigate myself. These interdisciplinary conversations are just so rich, and thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Eve, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo what Elizabeth's been saying. I feel like just listening, she's been so stimulating. I feel like we have many more collaborations, and we share a common goal, which is bringing forward the music and the art of women who created in an earlier time that have just not gotten their due. And it is I find powerful and personal work as well, as a woman. And, I just hope that the public will take this opportunity both to hear Elizabeth's concert with Sonnambula and to see this show and to be introduced to 17 different Italian women artists from an earlier time period. Their stories are fascinating and their works of art are extraordinary. So thank you so much, Amanda, for hosting this conversation.
Yes,
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. And on my closing thought, I'd just like to remind our audience that By Her Hand is opening February 3rd, and Sonnambula will be back with a full performance on March 31st, and that will be a live presentation on this program Thursday at 1 p.m. But next week, we'll be back Thursday, February 3rd for a studio visit with muralist Philip Simpson. And just as a reminder, the DIA is open. You can reserve your time to visit on our website, as well as check out our other special exhibitions that are happening now. So thank you so much for watching today. This was such a pleasure, and I hope to see you next week.